The night Reid Callahan got walked out of Clearwater General, the hospital assumed he was just a tired single father who had finally pushed one complaint too many past the wrong person at the wrong time. Hospital Administrator Diane Prescott had said it plainly, in front of 2 department heads and a government health auditor, that a maintenance technician who spent half his shifts filing internal safety memos instead of doing his actual job had no business questioning the clinical infrastructure decisions of people with medical degrees. She had said it the way certain administrators say things, not to inform but to finalize. Reid had listened without interrupting. He was good at that. His daughter, Nora, was 8 years old and waiting in the family lounge on the 2nd floor. Her school had let out early that afternoon for a professional development day, and there had been no one else to call. She had a library book in her lap and a granola bar she was saving, and she had been sitting very still the way she always sat when she sensed something was wrong, and had decided not to ask about it yet. Reid carried a paper bag with a few things from his locker, a pair of work gloves he had bought himself, a photo of Nora from the previous Canada Day, her face painted in a red maple leaf, a small flashlight he kept because the basement mechanical rooms at Clearwater were badly lit and he had never trusted the overhead fluorescents down there. The hospital's service corridor was white and long, and it smelled like disinfectant and recycled air. 2 members of facilities management walked behind him at the practice distance of people doing something uncomfortable as efficiently as possible. When he passed the 2nd floor lounge, he stopped. Nora looked up. Her expression shifted through 3 things in quick succession: recognition, confusion, and then the careful composure that children develop when they understand the adults around them are fragile in ways that require managing. He crouched to her level, there in the corridor with the fluorescent lights overhead, and told her they were heading home early today. He said it as a neutral fact, the way he said most things to her, not cheerfully, not heavily, just plainly. She tucked the library book under her arm and stood without needing to be asked twice. Diane Prescott was standing near the corridor junction. She had not needed to come out, she chose to. She said, for the benefit of anyone within earshot, that Reid had been given every opportunity to raise his concerns through the appropriate channels and had chosen instead to escalate them externally, which was a violation of his employment contract and a disruption to the hospital's preparation for its accreditation review. Reid looked at her and said quietly and without anger that the pressure bypass on the B-level mechanical room had been showing an intermittent fault for 11 days and that if it failed during a high-demand cycle it would take the HVAC circulation offline for that wing. He said that B-level served the post-surgical recovery unit. He said it the way a man says something he has already said to empty rooms too many times. Diane told him that the engineering team had reviewed it and cleared it for continued operation pending the next scheduled maintenance window. She said this with the confidence of someone who had read the summary of a report rather than the report itself. Reid said, without raising his voice, that the engineering review had been done remotely and without direct sensor access, and that the bypass valve was not generating clean data. He said it produced a clear reading because it had stopped fluctuating, not because it had stabilized, because it had locked. No one said anything. He took Nora's hand and walked to the exit. The automatic doors opened ahead of them, and the late October air outside was cold and sharp the way only Alberta cold gets. The kind that reminds you the sky goes on forever and the land underneath it is very flat and does not care much about human problems. His truck was 10 years old and the heat took a few minutes to come up properly. Nora sat in the passenger seat with Warren, a worn stuffed dog she had named after nobody in particular, tucked between her arm and her ribs. She watched the hospital building through the window as they pulled out. Then she looked forward and said nothing for a long time. Eventually she asked if he had done something wrong. He told her that he had told someone something true that they did not want to hear. She considered that for a block and a half. Then she said that her teacher said the truth was always the right thing even when it was hard. He said her teacher was right. She asked if it was hard. He said sometimes. She said okay and looked out the window again. Reid Callahan had worked at Clearwater General for 9 years. He had come to maintenance work through a path that most people at the hospital did not know and would not have expected. He had trained as a mechanical engineer at the University of Alberta before his wife, Joanne, became ill during his 3rd year of professional practice. He had left his engineering firm to take a position with more predictable hours and better benefits, something that let him be home by 6 and available when the calls came from the oncology ward. She had died 14 months later. Nora had been 4. Reid had stayed in maintenance work because the schedule fit what his daughter needed and because, as it turned out, he was very good at it. Not technician good, architect good. He understood systems the way people understand languages they grew up speaking, not by rule but by feel, by the particular sound something made when it was about to fail. Clearwater General was a mid-sized regional hospital in the kind of Canadian city that got overlooked in favor of Calgary or Edmonton, but handled a substantial patient load because it served 4 surrounding counties and 3 smaller communities that had no facility of their own. The building was 23 years old. Its mechanical systems had been upgraded in pieces over time, which meant they layered on top of each other in ways that created dependencies nobody had fully mapped. Reid had mapped them. He did it on his own time over 3 years, because nobody had asked him to and because it needed to be done. The B-level mechanical room contained the primary HVAC control junction for the hospital's north wing. The post-surgical recovery unit sat directly above it. It was served by a circulation system that maintained a specific air pressure differential to prevent cross-contamination between clean and non-clean zones. If that differential dropped, the air quality protocols in recovery would fail. It would not be immediately catastrophic. It would be the kind of failure that happened quietly, that took 12 to 18 hours to manifest in a measurable way, and that would not be traceable to a mechanical event unless someone knew exactly what to look for. The bypass valve on that system had started showing anomalous behavior 11 days before Reid was fired. He had documented it on day 3. He had filed a priority report on day 5. He had escalated to the facilities director on day 8 when the report had not moved. The facilities director had sent it to an external engineering contractor for review. The contractor had accessed the sensor logs remotely, seen a stable pressure reading, and signed off. What the contractor had not known, because Reid had not been consulted, was that the stable reading was a symptom, not a sign of health. The valve's internal position sensor had jammed. It was reporting a fixed value because it could no longer detect variation. The valve itself was seated in a partially closed position. Under normal load it held. Under high demand, the pressure differential would reach the valve's actual threshold and the bypass would fail to compensate. The HVAC junction would trip, the north wing circulation would go offline. Reid had included all of this in his Day 5 report. He had included schematics. He had included a projected failure timeline with 3 load scenarios. He had logged it in the system and emailed a copy to the facilities director's official address. The facilities director had forwarded it to Diane Prescott with a note describing it as a low-level technician overstepping his role in advance of the accreditation review, which was scheduled for the following month and required all systems to be documented as operational. Diane had reclassified the report as a scheduling request and moved it to the next maintenance window, which fell 6 weeks out. What neither of them had known was that Reid, 3 years earlier, had been part of a working group that redesigned the hospital's emergency mechanical protocols after a heating failure, had left an isolation ward without climate control for 6 hours in February. The group had produced a set of redundancy procedures. They had also, at Reid's suggestion, installed a secondary monitoring node on the B-level junction, a small independent sensor unit that logged pressure differential data locally and could trigger an alert through the hospital's general facilities system under specific failure conditions. The node had been installed. It had been logged in the building documentation. It had not been mentioned in any subsequent system summary because it was small and its alert channel was routed through a legacy infrastructure tag that no one had updated when the facility's software was migrated 2 years ago. Reid had never removed it. He had simply kept track of where it was. His apartment was 20 minutes from the hospital, on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and someone's cooking at all hours. The elevator was slow. Nora had named it Gerald and had opinions about Gerald's reliability. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a table that was always partially covered in either Nora's school projects or Reid's mechanical diagrams, and a wall beside the front door where Nora had taped a series of drawings she called her door collection. Each one was a different kind of door, some open, some closed, some in between. She had started making them after a conversation she had with Reid about why certain rooms at the hospital needed special doors. He had explained pressure differentials to her in terms of keeping sick air away from healing air, and she had decided this was important enough to document artistically. That evening, after dinner and homework and the particular ritual of Nora's bedtime that involved 2 books and a specific sequence of lamp switching that she had developed independently and enforced firmly, Reid sat at the kitchen table. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the mechanical diagrams he had been annotating for months, the full map of the B-level system he had built because no complete version existed anywhere in the hospital's official records. He thought about the bypass valve. He thought about the load projections he had run. The accreditation review was in 3 weeks. The hospital would have external evaluators walking through the building. Evaluators meant additional administrative load. Additional administrative load meant increased demand on support systems including climate control. Increased demand on a compromised valve under sustained high-cycle conditions. He went to bed at 11:15. He slept lightly, the way he always slept, one layer of awareness still running somewhere below the surface, paying attention to things he could not always name. At Clearwater General, the night shift ran with a smaller facilities team and a quieter administrative presence. The accreditation preparation had the overnight staff stretched thin. Diane Prescott had, in the 2 weeks before the review, quietly adjusted the facility's staffing schedule to concentrate experienced personnel on visible areas, corridors, public-facing systems, signage. The less visited mechanical spaces were being covered by a rotating roster of newer hires who were efficient and willing, but who did not have years of building-specific pattern recognition behind them. The B-level mechanical room had a routine check logged at 11:40 p.m. by a facilities technician named Owen Dufresne, who had been at the hospital for 7 months. He walked the room, visually checked the gauges, noted nothing unusual, and logged the check as clear. The bypass valve's position sensor reported a stable reading. Owen Dufresne did not know what a jammed sensor reading looked like versus a healthy one because no one had told him there was a difference, and the report that described it in detail had been reclassified into a scheduling queue he did not have access to. At 12:22 a.m., the B-level junction registered a load spike consistent with a high-demand cycle. It was a cold night and the building's heating load had stepped up. 2 operating rooms had been active since midnight on emergency procedures. The post-surgical recovery unit was at 83% capacity, unusually high for an overnight period. The bypass valve attempted to compensate. The position sensor reported normal function. The valve did not move. The secondary monitoring node that Reid had helped install 3 years earlier detected the actual pressure-to-differential change 17 seconds after the valve failed to respond. It sent an alert through the legacy infrastructure tag to the facility system. The facility system received the alert. Under the current software configuration, the legacy tag routed to a display field on the building management console in the overnight monitoring station. The overnight technician on duty was Owen Dufresne, who was currently on a walk of the third-floor utility corridor and would not be back at his console for approximately 9 minutes. The alert sat on the screen. In the post-surgical recovery unit directly above, a night nurse named Pauline Chen noticed, at 12:31 a.m., that the room temperature indicator on the ward's environmental panel had ticked down by 1 degree. She noted it and continued her rounds. By 12:37, it had dropped another degree. She stopped and looked at the panel more carefully. The pressure differential indicator was within normal range. The circulation readout showed active. Nothing was obviously wrong. She called the overnight facilities line at 12:38. Owen Dufresne answered at his console, where he had just seen the alert on his screen, and said he was looking into it. He looked at the alert. He looked at the building documentation index. He searched for B-level bypass protocol. What he found was the contractor's sign-off from 10 days earlier and a note indicating normal operation pending next maintenance window. He went down to B-level. He looked at the bypass valve. The position gauge showed normal. The pressure differential on the primary monitoring readout showed normal. The air from the circulation duct above him felt slightly different than it should have, not by a measurable amount, but different. He did not know what to do with that. He called his shift supervisor, who told him to log it for morning review if nothing looked visibly wrong on the board. He logged it. In recovery, the temperature had dropped another half a degree. Pauline Chen had begun moving patients' blankets and feeling, with the instinct of someone who had worked the unit for 11 years, that something was wrong in the building, not in any patient, but in the building itself. Reid's phone rang at 12:51 a.m. He looked at the screen. The number was the hospital's general facilities line. He had not worked there for 6 hours. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then answered. The voice on the other end was Owen Dufresne, who had found Reid's number in the institutional contacts directory under a previous incident report and who sounded precisely like a man who needed information he did not know how to locate any other way. Owen described the alert. He described the valve reading. He described the temperature drop in recovery. He described the contractor clearance and the clean board readings and the fact that the circulation system showed active on every indicator he could see. Reid sat up in bed. He asked one question. What was the pressure reading on the secondary node, the one logged under the legacy tag Facility Infrastructure B-7 Secondary? Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had to look. He looked. He read the number out loud. Reid said very calmly and without qualification, "You need to initiate the manual bypass protocol for the B-level junction right now. You need to call the duty charge nurse in post-surgical and tell her to watch patient vitals for the next 20 minutes, and you need to get your shift supervisor to call the facilities director at home." Owen said he had been told the system was cleared. Reid said the system was not cleared. He said the position sensor on the primary bypass was jammed and had been for 11 days. He said the reading Owen was seeing was a fixed false value. He said the actual valve state was partially closed under a load it could not handle, and that without the manual bypass the north wing circulation would continue to degrade. He said all of this clearly, as if explaining something he had already explained many times before, which he had. Owen Dufresne made a decision in the silence that followed that was not the kind of decision they trained for in facilities orientation. He initiated the manual bypass. The north wing circulation stabilized within 4 minutes. The patients in post-surgical recovery, who had been in rooms where the air quality had been quietly and invisibly deteriorating for 40 minutes, began to show improving environmental readings on the ward panel. None of them would know what had happened. Pauline Chen stood at her station and watched the pressure differential indicator normalize and felt the specific bone-deep relief of someone who had not known how tense she was until the tension left. Reid was already dressed by the time Owen called back to say it had worked. He was standing in the kitchen in his jacket looking at the diagram on the table. He called the number he had for the hospital's main administrative on-call line. The administrator on call that night was not Diane Prescott. It was James Okafor, a clinical operations director who had been at Clearwater for 16 years and who answered his phone on the second ring at any hour because he was that kind of man. Reid told him what had happened. He told him about the valve, the jammed sensor, the 11-day documentation trail, the reclassified report. He told him about the secondary node and the manual bypass. He told him that the primary bypass valve needed to be replaced, not reviewed, and that the replacement needed to happen before the accreditation review brought additional load onto the building's systems. James Okafor asked where the original safety report was filed. Reid told him exactly where it was, including the reclassification record that showed who had moved it and when. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would be at the hospital in 25 minutes and asked Reid to come in. Reid knocked on the door of the apartment across the hall. His neighbor, Hilda Brecht, who was 71 and kept unusual hours by her own admission, opened the door in a housecoat and accepted the spare key and the short explanation without apparent surprise. She had done this twice before. She went in and sat in Reid's kitchen, and Nora did not wake up. The hospital was bright the way hospitals are always bright, at any hour, the particular unvarying light of a place that does not acknowledge the difference. Between 2 a.m. and 2 p.m. Reid walked through the service entrance with his maintenance card, which had been deactivated as of 6:17 p.m. The gate did not open. Owen Dufresne met him at the door and let him in without being asked twice. The B-level mechanical room at 2:15 in the morning had the quality of a place that had recently held its breath and released it. The circulation system was running on the manual bypass. The primary valve sat in its housing, reporting normal on its jammed sensor, failing at its actual function. Reid crouched in front of it with a handheld diagnostic reader he had brought from the truck and confirmed in under 90 seconds what 11 days of documentation had already established. James Okafor arrived and came down to B-level without stopping at his office first. He looked at the valve, he looked at the diagnostic reading, he looked at Reid. He said he had spent the drive over reading the reclassification chain on the original report through the admin mobile system, and that he needed Reid to walk him through the technical sequence from the beginning. Reid walked him through it. James listened the way people listen when they are not preparing their response while the other person is still talking. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were precise and showed he had understood the explanation. Then he stood in the fluorescent light of the mechanical room and said quietly and without softening it that what he was reading in the reclassification chain suggested a deliberate suppression of a documented safety concern in advance of an accreditation review. Reid did not agree or disagree out loud. He looked at the valve. James called the hospital's chief of operations at home. Then he called the board chair. By 4 a.m., Clearwater General had a replacement bypass valve on order for emergency installation, sourced from a supplier 2 hours away who would not normally be called in the middle of the night. The facilities director, who had been reached at home, had arrived at the hospital and was in a conference room with James Okafor and 2 members of the board. Diane Prescott had also been called in. She arrived in professional clothes, which suggested she had not been sleeping, and she moved through the building with the particular speed of someone who had already begun constructing an explanation. Her explanation, when she offered it in the conference room, had the structure of a misunderstanding. The contractor review had been thorough. The reclassification had been a standard administrative categorization, not a suppression. The timeline was unfortunate. These things happened in complex systems. James Okafor placed the original report on the table in front of her, pointed to the reclassification timestamp and the administrator ID associated with it. He asked her to explain the categorization as a scheduling request when the document itself was flagged as a priority safety escalation. She said that in context, at the time, with the accreditation review approaching, it had seemed like the appropriate level of response. The board chair, a woman named Helen Sari, who had been on the Clearwater board for 12 years and who had sat through many meetings in which administrators said things shaped like explanations but built from avoidance, set the report back down on the table and said that she wanted to understand clearly whether a patient safety report had been deliberately routed away from review to protect an accreditation timeline. The room was quiet. Diane said that was not how she would characterize it. Helen looked at her for a long moment. Then she said that characterization was going to be the central question of the review that would begin the following morning, and that until that review was complete, Diane's operational authority was suspended. The facilities director looked at the table. Diane Prescott looked at the wall. Owen Dufresne was in the corridor outside, sitting on a folding chair with a paper cup of coffee, waiting to give his account of the evening's events. He had called Reid, not his supervisor, because the report Reid had written was the only document in the system that accurately described what he had seen. Owen was 26 and had been working facilities at hospitals for less than a year, and he had made the decision to initiate the manual bypass on the word of a man who had been walked out the door 7 hours earlier, and it had been the right decision, and he knew it, and he was also aware that knowing something and being comfortable with the institutional weight of having done it were two different things. He held his coffee with both hands and waited. Reid found him there at 4:40 a.m. Reid sat down in the chair beside him without being asked and said that he had done the right thing. Owen looked at him and said he hoped so. Reid said he did not need to hope. The recovery unit was stable. The patients were fine. The valve had been caught before it failed completely. Those were not matters of interpretation. Owen nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. Reid said that next time, and there would always be a next time in a building this old, Owen should trust the reading that does not match everything else. Not because the other readings are wrong, but because a single clean reading in a field of noise is usually the one that is lying. Owen looked at him. He said that was not in any training manual he had seen. Reid said he knew. At 6 a.m., James Okafor found Reid in the facilities team room, where Reid was updating the B-level schematic with handwritten notes to make the bypass routing legible to whoever would be doing the repair work later that morning. James stood in the doorway for a moment before Reid noticed him. James said that the board was formally requesting that the administrative suspension of Reid's employment be reviewed immediately, and that the documentation trail now made it apparent that the termination had occurred in direct response to a safety escalation Reid had properly filed and which had been suppressed without his knowledge. Reid set his pencil down. James said there was more. The accreditation body had been contacted by Helen Sari at 5:30 a.m. to disclose a potential interference with patient safety documentation in advance of the upcoming review. The accreditation team would be attending the hospital not as scheduled evaluators but as investigators. He said this was the right call. He said it had been the only defensible call once the documentation was laid out. Reid said he agreed. James asked if Reid would be willing to come back. Reid said there was something James needed to understand first. He said that the B-level valve was one item on a list he had been building for 2 years, cross-referenced against maintenance logs, load histories, and building age data. He said the list had 17 items on it. He said none of them were acute at this moment, but that 3 of them would become acute within the next 18 months under normal operating conditions. He put the list on the table. James read the first page. Then he said he needed Reid to walk him through all 17 items, starting with the most critical, and that he was going to cancel his 9 a.m. meeting to make time for it. Reid said he would need coffee. James said that could be arranged. The conversation about coming back happened 3 days later, not in a conference room, not in an administrative setting, not with prepared remarks and a folder of HR documentation, although those things existed and were handled by people whose job it was to handle them. It happened at Reid's kitchen table. James Okafor came to the apartment on a Saturday morning. He parked on the street and walked up 4 flights and knocked on the door. Nora answered. She was in an oversized sweater and had Warren tucked under her arm, and she looked at James with the direct, unhurried assessment of a child who has decided to evaluate this person before allowing the visit to continue. James crouched to her level. He said he had come to talk to her dad. He said he worked at the hospital where her dad worked. He said her dad had done something very important a few nights ago. Nora said she knew. James said he thought she might. Nora looked at him for another moment, then she stepped back from the doorway and called for Reid, and in that one unhurried step backward she had conducted, without knowing it, the evaluation that mattered most. Reid came from the kitchen. He saw James. He looked at Nora first. She gave a small businesslike nod, the nod of someone who has assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Nora sat at the edge and listened for a while and then went to her room to work on a new door drawing she was adding to the collection, one that had a small window in it so you could see through to the other side before deciding to open it. James laid out the offer plainly. A new position, Systems Safety Coordinator, built around the function Reid had been performing informally for years. The mandate was to conduct a full audit of every mechanical and environmental system in the hospital and produce a living maintenance map that could be accessed and updated by any qualified facilities technician. The position would report directly to the Chief of Operations, not through the facilities director chain. Any safety escalation filed through the position would have a direct review track to James's office and the board's safety subcommittee. Reid said there were things that needed to happen first. The list of 17 items had to be formally entered into the hospital's maintenance record with priority classifications assigned before the accreditation review. The secondary monitoring node on B level and 2 others like it elsewhere in the building had to be registered in the current system documentation, not legacy tags. Owen Dufresne, who had made the right call at 2 a.m. under significant institutional pressure and no formal support, had to be recognized formally for it, not just thanked in a corridor. James said yes to all 3 without pause. Reid said there was one more thing. He said that a technician at any level in the building had to be able to flag a safety concern without the flag being rerouted before it reached someone with the authority to act on it. He said this not as a complaint about what had happened. He said it as a design specification, the way he said everything that mattered. James said he understood the difference and agreed to it. Reid looked out the kitchen window. The October light in Alberta in the early morning is long and low and falls sideways across everything, making ordinary things look like they have been thought about carefully. The building across the alley. A water tower. The corrugated side of a parking structure 2 blocks east. He said he would come back. In the weeks that followed, the B-level valve was replaced. The 17 items on Reid's list were formally documented and priority ranked. Diane Prescott's administrative conduct was referred to the Provincial Health Authority's Standards Office. The facilities director, who had forwarded the original report with a note framing it as overstep, resigned 2 weeks before the formal review concluded. Owen Dufresne enrolled in a part-time mechanical systems course at the local college. He came to Reid after the first session and said some of the material made more sense now that he had seen a live failure. Reid said that was usually how it went. The accreditation review, when it was completed, noted the hospital's new documentation framework for mechanical safety systems as a model for other facilities of comparable size and age. The report specifically referenced the secondary monitoring nodes and the direct escalation track as features that improved safety accountability. It did not name the man who had designed them, because those reports rarely do. But Nora had drawn a version of the hospital that did something the real building could not quite manage. In the drawing, every important door had a small window in it. You could see the light on the other side before you had to choose. She gave the drawing to Reid on a Tuesday morning before school, matter-of-factly, the way she gave him most things that she had decided were important. He folded it with care and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket. He had meant eventually to frame it. He was in no hurry. Some things needed to be carried for a while before they were ready to be still.